Okay, here we go. Kinesiology 223, Chapter 5. This is book presentation number 3. Let's get to it. The book defines out two main types of stressors, internal versus external. Internal stressors are the things that the person thinks about, maybe their fear of failure, their self-doubt. External stressors are quite literally things out of the control of the athlete or the person. Things like weather, bad calls, coaches, the opponent. These are things that when you're in a competitive environment, there's a balance that you have between internal and external stressors. And in this scenario, there's only one of them you can control, and that's the internal stressors. The other side of that is you have to be able to manage, process, in some regards, maybe just mitigate how you interpret the external stressors. They're there, they're part of the competitive process, but ultimately, one you manage, or one you can control, and the other one you have to process and kind of like manage how you interpret those data points. I think you have to use it as a coaching point with your athletes and really talk with them about, look, here you are. Tell me what you can control. What are the things that you can actually dictate the outcome of? And to the point of this whole process is it's how you interpret and process the external stressors is really what it comes down to with your athletes. And you can do any number of team building skills and other skills with your athletes to help them with that process to upgrade or have a greater understanding. But it really comes down to how we process the external stressors. What I absolutely hone on with my athletes, it's ourselves. And that's the one thing you control in this entire process is how you interpret the external stressors and how you actually process all that. So let's go into this bottom part down here, and I'm really appreciative the book did this because they talk about injuries. And on the very bottom down here, their point is, there's a type of stressor that's related to sense of self-worth, the identity of the person. Perhaps will they return to play? Will they lose their scholarship? Will they have to transition out of their sport? Maybe they're going to go into coaching. When you're injured as an athlete, there's a lot of unknowns. And even when you're injured, I mentioned the person who had the knee replacement, there's some unknowns there as well. Will they be able to function? Can they walk up and down stairs? Will they ever be able to play soccer with their kid again? Those are the type of their grandchildren. Those are the types of things that really weigh on a person. And you have to really identify this and go, okay, these are stressors that people have to process and work with. And so when the book focused in on this, I thought it was great because like in my example, when I was playing football in college, I ended up being injured and I just couldn't play anymore. It just was not feasible. But I ended up getting involved on the coaching side of the house. So I was able to kind of reprocess my identity and have minimal identity crisis. But you'll have plenty of athletes who will have an identity crisis. And if you're an athletic trainer and you have an athlete who's injured and they're going through rehab with you, you'll see them go through this kind of identity crisis curve while they're working with you for return to play. With context-related sources of stress, right? And what I've talked about them a ton of times, like what the heck you're doing, who you're doing it in front of, who you're competing against, what's it like to work within a team environment, who's your coach, how do they interact with you, how do they treat, what's the environment that they create. And the two main types of context-related sources of stress come down to the importance placed on a particular event, is it preseason or the Super Bowl, and the outcome uncertainty, which is kind of silly when you think about it because no outcome is ever guaranteed when you get into a competitive event. But there is a certain amount of uncertainty that brings stress to the table. So when we talk about the importance placed on the event, the more important the event, usually the more stressful it is. A low pressure environment will really, yield a lower type of anxiety and really many times lower performance. And again, I use the example of preseason versus Super Bowl. Those guys in the Super Bowl are playing at a completely different level than the people in the preseason. And it's really about the perception of the person participating, right? If it's perceived to be a high pressure event, what you'll find is that anxiety was negatively related to performance. if the pressure's high and a person is anxious, they will generally have lower performance, right? And it's an inverse relationship between those two. And sometimes as a coach, you have to find ways to kind of down-regulate the urgency. Now, granted, we all want to win and everybody should have an urgency to win. That's kind of the goal when you play sports. But in some regard, as a coach, you may have to kind of down-regulate. And you'll hear many times coaches will say, hey, we're just focused on the next game. We're just focused on the next game. We're working towards this part of the playoffs. We're not focusing on the Super Bowl. We're just playing the next game. We're focusing on that and that only. That's ways to kind of down-regulate that stress seen in that external environment. It's kind of like that perceived pressure. The uncertainty. With anything in life, the greater the uncertainty, the greater the stress, of course. But no outcome is ever truly guaranteed in a sport activity, and even in life. But what you try to do is find ways to inform your participants, inform your athletes of things to expect so you can help them reduce the stress. Okay, fine. There is no outcome that's ever guaranteed, but we know as we go through our game, if we do this, this, and this, we have a better opportunity to win. If we prepare this way during the week, we have a better opportunity to win. So you can find ways to integrate in little nuggets for your athletes or even for your rehab people. Okay, if you do this and you're able to take a step and decelerate, I feel pretty comfortable that if you can do that 10 times, you can at least step up on this riser once. That's all I'm asking for, once. Those are little like breadcrumbs on a trail, if you will, for people to learn how to be successful. I always jokingly call it, you want people to be able to fall forward. It's the building in of small successes towards a larger goal or a larger success. And as a coach, as a therapist, as a trainer, you control that narrative and you control that process. You can build those into the process to the benefit of the person in front of you. So you have to think of it in terms of how you can integrate these things in and teach your people how to be successful. Now, there's main dispositions: high trait anxiety, low self-esteem, and social physical anxiety. And the book lists these things as like these three main areas where you have these kind of personal sources of stress. And when they talk about high trait anxiety, it's a personality factor that kind of predisposes the person to view competition kind of negatively. And what I didn't like about the book was they kind of were murky on how they describe it. But I think if you really look at this and you go trait anxiety or a highly trait anxious person, it perceives competition as more threatening and anxiety provoking than lower trait anxious person does. They did a better job kind of later on, right, in redeeming themselves in terms of how they describe what trait anxiety is. But with trait anxiety, this is what kind of people bring into the mix. This is just how they're wired and how they are predisposed to view a competitive environment. Now, self-esteem might have something to do with that, but with self-esteem, there's plenty of people regarding athletes who came from like challenging backgrounds, who had a karate coach, and they were just gifted as athletes, but they were just destroyed as a person. And they'll never, ever be successful. And it's just unfortunate, that happens. And many times you'll see like a coach will do this because we're going to break them down before we build them up. It's like, well, no, you're not in the Marines, buddy. Okay, you're trying to build a highly functioning team here, and really what you're doing is just destroying everybody on your team. That's unfortunate. So you'll have athletes where you'll have self-esteem it's tied to their performance. And if they have a great game, they have a high self-esteem moment. If they do poorly, they have a poor self-esteem moment. If they're injured, as I mentioned earlier in one of the other presentations or in the presentation, if they're injured, they will have low self-esteem because they've lost their identity. It's an ebb and flow. It's not static, right? And sometimes you can build things in for your athletes or your people to help them kind of like regain their confidence and regain their self-esteem. With social physique anxiety, you can kind of think of this in terms of somebody goes to a gym and they want to go work out. And when they go into work out, everybody looks fit to them. and they're the one person who's out of shape, which is rarely the case, right? Everybody in that place is all searching for the same goal to be in better shape or better fitness. But it's the perception, and it's the understanding that people become anxious when they observe, when others observe their physiques, right? And I can tell you, as a personal trainer, I have gotten way, way away from having people stand there, and I do anthropometric measurements in terms of measuring arms, thigh, waist. We do body composition now with handheld body composition readers or Tatana scales where you stand on a scale and you do bioelectrical impedance, either one, handheld or on the feet, or standing on a scale. And both are fine, both are appropriate, but it doesn't create the anxiety, the social physique anxiety of doing skin fold calipers on somebody who is overweight. They already know they're overweight. I don't have to make them feel worse in terms of getting my hands on them and doing skin fold calipers. So I do everything handheld or on a Tatana scale. And many times, people will feel like they're in a lab, and that's not what you want anyways, which is a whole nother conversation. But you're really, in my opinion, what I try to do is I'm trying to really mitigate or bring down the social physique anxiety that many people have when they come into a fitness facility. All right, so I'm going to jump into the next presentation, and I'll see you in a bit.